All right. Well, thank you so much for that opening. As you can see on the screen, hope you can all see this, today's agenda, we did go through the announcements and the opening ceremony. We'll be doing book 19 on organic alchemy. And this is the next to the last book on alchemy. We'll find it kind of interesting, and it has moved and shifted a little bit that we're going to talk about from just personal application to more corporate, or shall we say institutional application, how it's a bigger picture. We'll then have the closing ceremony. We'll stop the recording at that point, and then we'll commence with a question and answer period. This is very interactive. Do not hesitate to ask questions, or you can save them to the end. I'm certainly happy to go down either road with you. So just if you do think of a question, if you don't want to ask it right away, please do write it down. That way we're able to collect it and we can process that together, because if you have a question, almost assuredly somebody else has the same question. Plus, remember, this is being recorded and posted on light.org. Others will view this later on. So please do not hesitate to ask your questions. All right, so as I've continued on for the last few books, you're to the point now, as you've progressed to book 19, that we are called upon to focus and apply what we've learned. There's 4 concepts that are foundational to this. The first is categorized as to know. Knowledge needs experience. Taking and applying, using, considering, praying about, and then looking for avenues of service. Because until you apply the knowledge you've learned, you cannot incorporate it successfully into who you are as a spiritual being and as a physical being. We strongly encourage you to find service outlets, either within the church or without the church of light, and to exercise this knowledge for the benefit not only of yourself, but the benefit of the human race and for the rest of the world. There's also an element, we're going to talk a little bit more about that today, of to will. In other words, of knowing what you want and the ability to formalize that in a statement. So many times I've caught myself with vague notions of desire, of something good, of some intention, but yet I had trouble putting it all together and coming down with a concise statement. The clearer you can be on what you want to happen, the more likely of that event or some element of that event occurring will take place. That also requires you to dare, to take appropriate risks, not careless risks, but appropriate risks in your spiritual practice. That may mean that you end up trying and making an effort to teach a class or co-teach a class. One way to really learn a topic is to teach it, I found. Most of you know I teach in a undergraduate program, business and psychology classes. And boy, I've sometimes have had some knowledge, probably pretty good knowledge of a topic, but until you teach it, you really don't know a topic. So if you want to learn more about alchemy, you want to learn more about a specific element of your spiritual walk, develop a class or co-develop a class. And I assure you that your level of knowledge will really increase. To be silent is interesting. And I label this sharing appropriately. One of the things that sometimes I get so excited that I just want to share with everybody. I want to tell them all about what I know, even if they have no idea what I'm talking about, or it's not appropriate for them. It is better to not share and to seek out and find those individuals that will benefit from what you are experiencing than to just broadcast that out. In the Judeo-Christian community, they call that not casting your pearls before swine. reserve and share appropriately with people that you believe or know will benefit from this and can interact with you. So these are just 4 things: to know, to will, to dare, and to be silent. I think are 4 concepts to focus on as we come to the very near conclusion of the 21 books in this series. I've also, this last couple of weeks, been made aware and made a connection that has always been right before my eyes, but for whatever reason, never really pulled it together. And that is about the concept of I am. Now, most of you may know within the Judeo-Christian tradition, again, one of the names of deity is I am. I am that I am, along with several other names. This is significant, and I failed for up until just very recently connecting together this with our status as co-creators. Almost all religious traditions, and I would say all, but I'm sure there may be an exception, see the human race as co-creators. That, and as we practice, we believe that we are the, if you will, the directors of our existence, that we have the ability to vastly influence, if not actually control, how we react to experiences. We may not be able to change the experiences, whether they occur or not, but we certainly can control ourselves and how we react. And the significance of the I am statement for me really came forward when we talk about the practicality and the benefit of our self-talk and the use of affirmations. You will hear yourself, or for sure hear others say, I'm a failure, or I am no good, or I can't do this. That's probably my favorite one that I fight against. And when you say I am, you are creating. You are a part of deity. And the importance then of how you self-talk, of how you word your statements to self and others, will dramatically impact the outcome. We call this directed thinking, is in the terminology that Zane uses. But yet in our affirmations and our ability to create, we have the ability to say, I am successful. I am spiritual. I am happy. I am capable. And as we say these words, changes occur. As we incorporate directed thinking, the use of alchemy, the use of tarot, and the use of astrology to know the external forces, the winds that are blowing about us, we have the ability to, if not change the events, to at least change how we handle the events. And I see that as profound and one of the ultimate definitions and applications of alchemy in our lives. So I just wanted to share that with you today because I just, as I say, find that to be so relevant to the use of alchemy. Some additional concepts that are fundamental to alchemy will be termed integrated thinking. And this came from a paper that I'm happy to share with you. Finding balance in our lives is so critical, but especially in terms of reading, contemplation, and integration of our studies into our thoughts, into our being. And Woods actually came up with 8 steps that I think are just tremendous. The first is don't stop reading. We, after completing these 21 books, you may say, now I've got it all. Well, actually not. You have the foundation to now explore and a base of reference to be able to judge and assess other writings, other teachers, other materials against a very solid foundation in the fundamentals of Hermetic studies. So don't stop reading. Do not accept everything as truth, but evaluate and compare it. Even Zane talks about don't accept what he says as truth. Experience this in your own life, because thinking for yourself will make your thoughts your own. Now, how many people, we all know that they just parrot another teacher, they parrot another, or just speak the words of another person. But yet when you get right down to it, you got to kind of ask yourself, is that really who they are? Their actions don't seem to be consistent with what may be the words that they're saying. So as you take, and one thing that I encourage my students to do is paraphrase. This is one of the important things of writing, of academic writing, is you cannot and should not take credit for other people's work. They call that plagiarism. But paraphrasing it and putting it into your own words makes it yours, and then you give credit accordingly. So combine your reading with thinking for yourself. Look at your life's experiences. Look at the interactions on a daily basis. Start asking yourself, wow, what do I think about this? I know what this reader, or what Zane says, or what Alan says, or what whoever says, but what do I think? How does this line up with my understanding and experience to date? If you can't read much because of time constraints, we're all busy. Many have families, work relations, other types of actions and activities. Make sure you're reading quality material. If you're going to study, make sure you're studying something that is beneficial and not just superfluous. It's so easy to read the light stuff and then avoid some of the heavier, challenging material. Mix it up. Make sure that you're reading well. And when you read, I love to do a highlighter. My books, and some people get real upset about this, but I make notes, I mark my books. I really engage with the material to at least put my thoughts down that I come back and later and reflect on. Also, read for company and encouragement in your thinking. We stand on the shoulders of so many other men and women that have spent their lives focusing on these areas and these topics. It's incredible, but I find as much or more valuable information in many of these books that I'm researching now back from the turn of the century, and I'm talking about the turn of the 20th century, so back in the early 1900s. And when so much was the scientific knowledge had not yet advanced, but the thought processes and the theories that these individuals were developing were emerging, and we're now finding were extremely valid and have shown to be very true. So don't discount just because it's an older work that it may not be current. It may be actually as or more current than a lot of what's being written today. So also, don't be afraid of poetry and prose. Sometimes I get intimidated by poetry just because it takes more time to decipher. Beautiful writing can lead to very intelligent and, shall we say, challenging thoughts and ability to think for yourself. Symbolism is such a large part of the materials of these 21 books. Also, don't discount the various poets, the spiritual poets that are out there. And then the last thought that Woods came up with was to make your thoughts known. Put them on paper. Don't be afraid to write and to share with an appropriate audience. The way that we learn if we are going down the right direction is by interacting with others. And let me tell you, sometimes that can be a challenging process, sometimes even a painful process. As other people will say, well, what about this? Why didn't you bring that up? And we learn of our own areas of deficiency and areas that we can improve as we capture our thoughts and put them from down on pen and paper. A thought in your mind is not reality till you put it down in writing, is what I found. And I know there's been several individuals, learned individuals, that have said this over and again, that you may have a thought, you may have a construct, you may have a connection that you make between two ideas. But until you put that down in writing, it may be lost and certainly can't be interacted by and with others. So I encourage you, take the risk of writing, of teaching, of presenting. There are many of us here that will help you and interact with you and give you guidance out of our base of experience. It's certainly not because we're the experts. It's only because maybe we'd be a little further down the path than you are. So these are just some ideas on integrated thinking, because as we get into this book, we get into some of the broader concepts of chapter 1, serial lesson 209, that life continues to surge forward. Now, I was listening to the news, reading in the paper, talking about the number of different creatures that are ready to or on the verge of extinction, but yet still there is an abundance of life on Earth and the continued emergence of new life on Earth. There's also an influx of life waiting to appear. And I always find this to be really fascinating. If you refer to page 7 in the Green Book, you will see this discussion, because it becomes quite engaging, that there are spiritual entities that are looking to move into the physical realm. Now, we may not and probably do not understand the full process and what that means and what these creatures are, or what these entities are. Are they even creatures? But there is this drive to move from the astral to the physical plane of existence among life. Now, this also gets back that life originates then in the astral plane, not in the physical plane. So just like with our whole Hermetic tradition, as above, so below, that we believe that there is an existence separate in the astral plane, separate from the physical plane, and that it moves that direction here and then here back to that direction. Also, these various organisms have various degrees of intelligence. Now, as you read this material, you'll also find that there are entities, there are elements of creation that we in science may not consider to be alive, such as minerals and metals. But yet, in our definition, you will see that all of existence is alive, and it has intelligence of some form. And as it progresses up the chain, it gathers from these previous experiences and moves up in the intelligence. Now, we'll say this again here shortly, but Church of Light does not practice reincarnation. What we believe is we move to another level of existence, but not come back and keep repeating. We don't get stuck. And this progression is a progression that takes place from inception of a creation, of an entity, of an existence, all the way through from human to that next step that is in another plane of existence. We'll talk a little bit more about that in the next book. So all forms of life possess an unconscious mind. And I think this is from single cell entities to what we'll call inorganic substances possess some form of mind. And when you think about this in the way that the influence and the change For those of you who use crystals or use some type of mineral, you know that that can have an impact. You may have seen and experienced that impact. Well, as you read this material, you start to see that their unconscious mind interacts with us. And there's a couple of really good stories on pages 33 through 40, particularly focusing on the lilac and chipmunks, how these entities, these creatures, one plant, one animal, and they could have done of a mineral or metal, all have an existence, all have a purpose, all have life lessons to share and be learned from. Now, there's also this in chapter 3, serial lesson 211, the universal law of soul progression from one cell plant life to animals to advanced life forms. There's a progression in each manifestation. This is what we talk about, where there is not a sticked, so you're getting stuck somewhere and finding yourself repeating a cycle or going backwards. Now, you may end up carrying forward some of the characteristics. That is going to be discussed a little more next time. Or the patterns of life, of items that need to be processed. But what we have here is the innate ability for life to move forward. Also with this is a continual development of morality and mortality. We will see that as life evolves from simple to advanced, that a universal moral code begins to appear that is not culturally based, that is not situationally based. It is more of a universal base that is exhibited throughout life. One of those, and you can read about this on pages 53 through 59, there's in the green book. But what we want is that we want to see that there is the concept of desire for pleasure and an avoidance of pain by personal accountability and responsibility for our actions and our interactions. For instance, what is the common reward for good work? Well, money, honor, recognition. Some of these are internal, some of these are external. We look to self-satisfy, and we balance this with the good and the benefit that we give to society, balanced with self-serving. And this is sometimes a very delicate tension that we find that we can be pulled toward focusing on self-gratification rather than doing what it benefits all, especially when it comes to the construct of money or honor and recognition. To get stuck and to say, I'm working solely for the recognition from others. We all know people that are there, that have been stuck there. Or I certainly have fallen into the trap over my lifetime where I worked for exclusively for financial reward. Sometimes, and sometimes more often than not, to the detriment of the common good, because it was all about what I could get. Out of that really comes that there is a realization of value, and that self-satisfaction is ultimately the greatest reward. I know lots of people, matter of fact, I probably know more people with money that are unhappy than more poor people that are unhappy. It is really critical to understand what it is that truly rewards and make you happy. In one of the classes, psychology classes and business classes I teach, we talk about the difference between internal motivation and external motivation. Well, with internal motivation, you are doing things because you aspire to that end. I'm getting my doctorate because it's not certainly the financial benefit at my age, but because it's something I've always a life goal. It's a tremendous amount of work, sometimes almost an overwhelming amount of work. But I continue to do the one step in front of the other because it is something that inspires and drives me. The external factors would say, give it up, go do something else. And that's the problem with external motivation, is more often than not, it's short-lived. For instance, giving somebody a pay raise in a work environment typically only has a 90 to 180 day benefit. After that, they become accustomed to that higher level of pay, and it no longer is a motivating factor. Whereas if you can find out what truly motivates an individual, or as we find out for ourselves, such as the study of these materials, the understanding of the application of alchemy that we learned earlier, how astrology can show us the external forces that we can then take alchemy and apply to minimize the negative and to maximize the positive. All of these can then start to form a base for internal motivation that can be extremely rewarding and extremely constructive. Pain has one purpose, and that's to inform of a destructive condition present. Now, that may seem obvious, and this is from chapter 4, serial lesson 212, but I know people that are in a repeated cycle of doing things that cause them pain, that cause displeasure, that cause upset. And you could say by the same token that pleasure also has one purpose, to inform the soul of a favorable condition. Now then, we all know that this is not 100% true on either side. Pain can be a warning. Pain can also be an incentive that something needs to be addressed. Pleasure can be very seductive. And if one only focuses on life's pleasures, then we end up in a situation where we may pursue pleasure for the sake of pleasure rather than the underlying purpose it serves. One of my favorite Twilight Zones, the old black and white ones, the Rod Serling ones, was a person who was sentenced to hell. And their sentence was that they would receive and get anything that they ever desired and wanted. And so for the first few months, they were really happy. I mean, they had wealth, they had, the pleasures of the flesh, they had everything. And then it became boring because there was no item to work for, because anything was available to them. And sometimes I think that is one of the challenges that we forget about, is that to appreciate the positive, we have to see the negative. To want not to experience more of the negative, we have to see the positive. And that life has a balance, it has a rhythm. And as our soul is able to comprehend, as we are able to practice and learn the, not secrets, but just the methodology to be able to be whole, a whole person that experiences life and moves through life in a constructive manner, not necessarily a pain-free one, but one, not necessarily 100% pleasurable one, but one that receives balance, is that we are then more able to care for ourselves and others. There's also the truism, and he repeats it here, and I have tended to come to believe this more than other. Ability, and I'll say learning, Life lessons arise out of overcoming difficulties more than success. I know almost without exception that my mistakes have been more powerful learning tools than when I did something correctly. I remember my mistakes. I hopefully have learned from those mistakes. But just doing things right does not necessarily mean you're going to do things better. And you're going to learn and continue to grow. Difficulties allow for adaptation and change within us. And that's really kind of the purpose of that section. Now, as Zane says, the most important obstacle to be overcome with is the astrological winds that blow. The situations that arise because of cosmic forces, including the sun. Peg and I were talking about before we started how one course that I'm really looking forward to, because I need to do it, is how to put a chart together manually without the aid of a computer. As we might have a solar flare or some other electromagnetic disturbance, we may lose our electronic devices. It will become even more critical then that you can put a chart together manually and successfully and correctly. I remember, and you probably do from book 10, that you had to construct a manual chart, and just how challenging that was. And if you made a little mistake in the first part, that mistake carried all the way through and amplified. So knowing how to do that will help you to be able to understand the external influences that are upon you. That is why it's so important on a regular basis to create a chart. What is a regular basis? I do mine weekly. You can do it monthly. You can do it whenever. But the important thing is foreknowing is forearming. If you don't know something's coming, you do not have the opportunity to use directed thinking and alchemy to correct it. Also, I will use the tarot as part of the confirming, and I'll use the pendulum. So I will try to get as many different ways and as many different angles of confirmation, especially of difficulties that are arising, and the solutions to overcome them. Now, like I said, I may not be able to eliminate them, and likely I probably won't be able to. But what I can do is minimize my negative response. Bad things happen. Death, loss, pain. But how you react to those is truly more of an indication of the change within. Those things happen to everybody. Some people fall apart. Some people give up. Others walk through it. What's the notion again within the Hebrew tradition of what we call the 23rd Psalm? Even though I walk through the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Death is something that the end of this physical existence will come. But with knowledge and with the ability to understand, by using the tools that we have made available to us, we are able to overcome and react in a positive rather than a destructive manner. So realize these. There's also the universal law of compensation. It's chapter 5, serial lesson 213. There is a tremendous need to understand life's purpose for you. I believe, Zane also believes this, and reinforced it, is that each of us have a purpose. Now, is that going to be defined down to the nth degree? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. I know I'm supposed to teach. That's one of the things that I find my passion, I find my love in, I find my motivation in. And for so long, I tried to fight that. But when we act consistently with our life's purpose, we will find a degree of satisfaction and success that we never did before. Maybe not financial success, maybe it will be financial success. But the reward for that effort then arises beyond the simple pain and pleasure, but is rewarded then as we walk in the path that is laid before us with even greater insight and abilities. Now, greater insight and abilities does not mean that other people will even see them or know them or be impacted by them. I believe most of them, they will be, but more so that you understand, that you can see what others do not see, that you can react in ways that other people fight, and yet you accept because you understand what the outcome and the ultimate reward is. Greater abilities, I believe, is such a vast and important reward that we receive. Chapter 6, the Universal Moral Code. And this almost is kind of going back and repeating some things here. But one of the things that we seek to do is to move to higher vibratory rates. The higher that we, if you will, experience life at a higher rate, vibratory rate, the more positive the outcome will be. And how we treat others, how we treat ourselves, how we view life. And again, it transcends this whole idea of pain and pleasure and really starts to evolve and help us to understand that moral code that is within us all, that is around us all, and the realization of what it is. Discerning God's great plans. A greater consciousness is present at every level. We talked a little bit about this, and again, the book starts repeating a little bit here, that life is progressive. Life is more universal and more widespread than what we may have attributed it to. But just remember that it is there and is to be respected. You know, we talked about in an earlier session how a pendant, for example, a mineral or a metal, can be alive or dead, and it can lose its abilities or gain its abilities. You may want to go back and review that. It's really fascinating to talk about that, but that exists at every level and progresses forward. Now, can we go off on the wrong track? And the answer is absolutely yes. Matter of fact, there are occasions almost daily. 3 different avenues that Zane identifies that you got to be really careful about and very aware of. First is academic materialists, the second is religious bigots, and the third is exploitation of others. You know, that I'm part of an academic community, and if you want somebody who thinks they know the answer, ask someone who's in a college or university in their subject. What they know is what is currently known. Unless they are continuing to experiment, they don't know what they don't know, and even what they know possibly will change. Look at the area of biology. Look at in astrophysics. The information coming from the new telescope that's been put into orbit just a few months ago almost erases so much of what they understood about astrophysics. And on the same note, just on a different scale, religious bigots. And I'm going to take a more modern term and say extremism. Right now, we see in our country and in the world a growth of extremism on all political spectrums. Rather than finding ways to work together, it's more, how can I get my way? How can I force my belief system or my structure on you, regardless of what you want? You will find that there will be those who will oppose people who think. This has happened throughout the ages, from time immemorial. A free person, a free thinking person, becomes a target because they are a threat. They cannot be easily controlled. Also, as you may be tempted to exploit others with your information, with your knowledge, with your skills, the exploitation of others can really lead you down a path that is self-destructive. Yes, you may gain material rewards. Yes, you may get temporary pleasures, but in the end, it's almost like sacrificing your own soul. So when is a soul moral? When are we at our highest and best? And that's when we contribute to the cosmic welfare. When your efforts, your works, your words, your actions are contributing to universal good, to be that helping hand, to be a kind voice, and to be the person who gives a drink of water. And as we contribute in other ways to, again, alleviate and fight ignorance, we work toward the betterment of others along with the betterment of ourselves, we start to see a new morality emerging that Zane calls soul morality, that I think is just a further explanation of God's plan. So that's the material. It's not a long book, but it's a very engaging book that takes and challenges us to integrate and use the lessons of the prior books, and challenges to say, now what are you going to do with them? How are you going to benefit yourself and benefit others? How are you going to act in a higher morality? How are you going to enact your purpose and be able to bring healing and bring that, the needed health to the world around you, which conversely then heals us. So with that, let me go to the closing ritual, and then we will do a question and answer, because I'm sure you probably have some questions. Peg, is there anything before